The man nobody would even look at was the one who saved her. And that one moment, well, it changed the course of their lives for good. Have you ever been the belle of the ball, so to speak, but felt like a ghost in the room until the one person nobody else would give the time of day to finally seize the real you? This story here happened way back in 1928, out in the countryside, in a little old town called St. Sebastian's Valley. Now, before we get too far in, do us a favor and drop a comment to let us know where you're tuning in from. It means the world to us to have you here, and it helps our channel bring more heartfelt stories, just like this one, to folks like you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
Catherine Miller was 26 years old, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind she was the most beloved young lady in all of St. Sebastian's Valley. She was the daughter of Anthony Miller, the fellow who owned the main general store right in the heart of town. Growing up, she got to know just about every family in those parts. Her daddy was a good, respected man, a straight shooter who built that business from the ground up over 30 years. The store was planted right in the town square, a sturdy building with thick walls and big windows that just soaked up the golden afternoon sun. You could buy anything in there, from flour and sugar to fancy imported cloth and farming tools. It was the place everyone ended up, where the town news got passed around as fast as the goods. Catherine had been helping her father since she was just a little thing. She knew every customer's name, the story of every family, and she always remembered the little things that made a person feel noticed. When Mrs. Irene came by for embroidery thread, Catherine would already have her favorite shade of blue waiting. When Mr. Boniface stopped in for his tobacco, she'd be sure to ask how his wife was doing, knowing she was getting over the flu. These weren't just simple kindnesses. They were real, coming straight from the heart. Catherine genuinely cared. That warm, thoughtful way about her was not for show. It was just who she was, and on top of it all, you could not help but see how pretty she was. She had long brown hair that shimmered like honey in the sunlight, warm amber eyes, and a smile that could brighten the darkest corner. She did not need fancy dresses or flashy jewelry. She wore plain clothes, but they were always spotless and neat. Even so, and maybe because of it, she turned heads everywhere she went. Men would stop and stare when she walked down the street. Conversations would die down when she walked into church on Sundays. You could almost hear folks sigh as she passed. But all that attention had started to feel like a heavy blanket on a hot day. Catherine had lost count of all the young men who came to the store, asking her father for a chance to court her. They all sang the same old tune, telling her she was the prettiest girl they had ever laid eyes on, that she would make a perfect wife, that they would give her the world. They were nice words, but they felt hollow. Not a single one of them ever asked her what she liked to do. None of them seemed to care about what was on her mind. They wanted to put her on display, not get to know her soul. They wanted the lovely Catherine on their arm like a man wants a prize-winning painting hanging on his wall. You had the judge's son, a handsome fellow who talked a big game about politics and the grand future ahead of him, but not once did he ask about her own dreams. Then there was the nephew of that rich rancher from over in Santita, who rode in on a fine horse and just had to mention how much land his family owned 3 times in one visit. There was even the new school teacher, a learned man who would recite poems from France, but he looked at Catherine like she was a statue in a museum, something beautiful to be admired from afar. Catherine turned them all down, ever so politely. Her mother, Mrs. Amelia, was beginning to fret. She did not push her daughter, but she started dropping those little hints that only a mother can, saying how Catherine was already 26, that good men do not grow on trees, and that she was getting a bit too particular. Her father was more patient, always saying his girl would get married when she found a fellow who was truly worthy of her. But even he would give her a puzzled look now and then, as if he could not quite figure out what she was holding out for. The honest truth was, Catherine could not rightly explain it herself. Deep down in her gut, she just knew she wanted to be loved for who she was inside, not for what she looked like on the outside. She yearned for someone who could see past her pretty face, a man who was real and true, who did not feel the need to win her over with his money or with well-practiced speeches. She wanted a man whose actions would prove his character far better than any promises could. Now, while Catherine was drowning in attention she never asked for, on the other side of the coin was a man who lived a life of pure, quiet solitude. His name was Vincent Drummond, and he owned Wild Ridge Farm, a good-sized piece of land about 6 miles out of town, tucked away up in the hills that gave the place its name. The farm had been his father's, a hard man who had passed on 8 years before, leaving the whole spread to his only boy. Vincent had worked that land all by himself ever since. Down in the village, his reputation was lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. Folks said he was a dangerous fellow with a mean streak a mile wide, that nobody could work for him because he was just plain ornery. They whispered that he lived more like a wild creature than a man, staying away for months at a time, and only showing his face to sell some cattle and grab what he needed before vanishing back into the hills. In hushed tones, they'd even gossiped that he was hiding some awful secret up on that ridge, something that would explain why he chose such a lonely life. Vincent would ride into St. Sebastian's Valley maybe once a month, always by himself, and always on the same chestnut horse with a dark, flowing mane. He would get to town at the crack of dawn, handle his affairs with a quiet purpose, and be gone before the sun was high in the sky. He never said hello to anyone unless he absolutely had to. He did not stick around to chew the fat. He never smiled. When he came into Anthony Miller's store for his supplies, he would place a written list on the counter, stand there in silence while they gathered his things, pay the exact amount, and leave with a slight nod that you could hardly call a farewell. Folks would give him a wide berth when he walked by. Mothers would snatch their children close, as if his very shadow might bring them harm. The men would look anywhere but at him. Little kids would point and whisper until an adult shushed them. Vincent paid it no mind at all. His face was a closed book, his jaw set firm, and his eyes always seemed to be looking at something far off in the distance. He wore simple work clothes, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face, and boots that were worn soft from years of hard use. Catherine had seen him a handful of times over the years, but only from a distance. He never once came into the store when she was working the counter, almost as if he was trying to avoid any chance of talking to her. She had heard all the stories, of course. The whole town loved to talk about him. But Catherine had learned long ago not to put too much stock in gossip. She knew how town folk could spin a yarn and turn a stranger into a boogeyman. It was on one afternoon in March that their two worlds were finally fixing to collide. Catherine had gone out to visit Mrs. Lucinda, an old family friend who lived on a small farm about an hour's ride from the village. The visit had been lovely, filled with warm tea and easy conversation. Mrs. Lucinda was feeling much better from the arthritis that plagued her, and Catherine had brought along a special ointment her mother had made from herbs. They got to talking and lost all track of time. And when Catherine finally waved goodbye, the sun was already sinking low. She was driving the little wagon her father had let her borrow, pulled by their gentle mare, Star, who knew the road by heart. The sky had been heavy all morning with bruised-looking clouds that promised a good storm was on its way. But Catherine reckoned she could beat the rain home. Boy, was she wrong. With about half an hour still to go, the first drops started to fall. Before she knew it, those drops turned into a real gully washer. The rain came down in sheets, one of those fierce March storms that swells the roads into creeks and turns the whole world into a gray smudge. Catherine could not see more than a few feet ahead of her. Star plodded on, spooked by the thunder that kept cracking open the sky. Catherine held the reins tight, soaked to the bone, trying to keep her cool even with her heart hammering against her ribs. Her biggest mistake was deciding to cross the creek. On any other day, that creek was just a little ribbon of clear water babbling over smooth rocks, so shallow it would not even get the tops of your boots wet. But with all that rain pouring down, it had become a raging, muddy torrent, much wider and deeper than it should have been. Catherine paused for a moment on the bank. The bridge was a ways up the road, but taking that detour would add nearly another hour to her trip. She was soaked through, shivering, and just wanted to be warm and dry back home. She figured she could get across in a hurry. Star stepped into the churning water. The first few steps were steady enough, but right in the middle, where the water was up to the mare's chest, a powerful surge of water hit them from the side. The wagon lurched hard. One of the wheels dropped into a deep hole hidden beneath the murky water. It all happened in a heartbeat. Next thing she knew, the whole wagon went over. Catherine was tossed into the furious, freezing current. The icy water knocked the wind right out of her. The current grabbed her and pulled with a terrifying strength. Catherine struggled to get her feet under her, but there was no bottom to be found. She tried to swim, but the water just tumbled her over and over, twisting her around until she did not know which way was up. She choked on water, coughed, and cried out for help, knowing good and well no one could hear her. Her heavy skirts were dragging her down. A cold wave of panic washed over her. She was going to die right there, drowned in a creek she had known her whole life, just a few short miles from her own home. And it was just then that a powerful hand clamped onto her arm. Catherine did not even see him coming. All of a sudden, there was a man in the water beside her, as tall and solid as an old oak tree, holding her with a grip that left no room for struggle. He pulled her in close to his chest. Chest. A deep voice hollered close to her ear, telling her not to struggle. Catherine went limp, following pure instinct. The man hauled her through the rushing water with a will made of iron. Every single step he took was solid and sure, his muscles straining against his drenched shirt. He never wavered, never slipped. They made it to the riverbank. The man set her down on the wet grass with a gentleness that seemed impossible after the raw power he'd just shown. Catherine dropped to her knees, spitting up water, her body shaking something fierce. The rain and her own fear blurred everything. It took a long moment for her vision to clear. When she finally looked up, she saw the face of the man who had saved her. It was Vincent Drummond. He was kneeling right there beside her, his black hair stuck to his forehead, rain trailing down his sharp-boned face. His eyes were dark, almost jet black, and so intense they seemed to cut right through the storm. Vincent asked if she was hurt, asked if... His voice was low and rough, but she could hear real worry in it. Catherine just shook her head, not yet able to find her own words. He gave her a quick professional once-over, like a man used to checking livestock for injuries. He seemed content that nothing was broken. Vincent shrugged off the heavy leather coat he wore, which was still mostly dry inside, and draped it over her shoulders. The act was fast, almost abrupt, but thoughtful. Catherine felt the warmth left over from his body in the leather, smelled the scent of honest work and rich soil and something else that was just him. Vincent told her they had to get out of the downpour. She tried to argue, to say she had to find the wagon to look for Star, but he was already pulling her to her feet. There was a small building not far off, a little tool shed some farmer had put up by the road. Vincent led her toward it, his hand firm on her elbow, but not rough. The inside smelled like damp wood and earth. It wasn't much, but it kept the rain off. Vincent struck a match and found an old lantern hanging on a nail. The dim yellow light turned the tiny shed into a safe little bubble in the middle of all that chaos outside. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out weak and shaky. She started to thank him. Vincent stopped her with a simple hand gesture, saying it was not necessary. She insisted, asking what his name was. He paused for a long moment, as if telling her was some kind of great sacrifice. At last, he answered, Vincent Drummond. Vincent. The name hit Catherine like a bolt of lightning. So this was the hard-faced rancher, the man the whole town was afraid of, the very same man who had just thrown himself into danger to save her without a second thought. She told him her name, Catherine Miller. Vincent gave a small nod like he already knew. And of course he knew, she realized. In a town this small, everybody knew everybody, even if they never said a word to each other. A strange quiet settled between them, broken only by the angry drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Vincent kept his eyes away from hers. He stood over by the door, looking like he was ready to bolt the second he wasn't needed anymore. Catherine became aware that she was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the shock of it all hitting her at once. She had almost died. If Vincent had not shown up, she would have drowned for sure. The cold truth of it washed over her. Tears started to fall without her permission, mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. She tried to hide her face, feeling ashamed of her weakness, but her choked sobs gave her away. Vincent took a hesitant step toward her, looking mighty uncomfortable. He clearly was not a man who knew what to do with a crying woman. He just stood there for a second, looking torn between wanting to help and wanting to keep his distance. Finally, in a stiff motion, he sat down on an old wooden crate that was being used as a bench. He kept a respectful space between them, but offered his silent company. His presence was comforting in a strange way, solid, dependable, asking for nothing. After a few minutes, Catherine got a hold of herself. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a long, shaky breath. She apologized for being so weak. Vincent told her it was not weakness. He said it was how anyone would act after almost dying. His voice was softer than she would have ever expected. He added that she had been brave out there in the water, a situation that would have sent most folks into a full-blown panic. For the first time, Catherine truly saw him without the haze of town gossip. Vincent was a tall man with shoulders built from honest-to-God hard work. He looked to be about 30 years old, give or take a few. His face was all angles and a strong jaw covered in a few days of scruff, with a nose that had clearly been broken once upon a time. He wasn't handsome in the way folks in magazines are, but something about him just pulled you in. It was the fire in his eyes, the sureness in his every move, and the way he wasted no words, making each one count for something. She tried to strike up a conversation, asking if he was heading back to his farm when he spotted her. Vincent answered with a single sound of agreement. She then asked if he lived out there by himself. He confirmed it just as simply. She tried a different angle, mentioning she'd never been out to Wild Ridge, but that folks claimed it was a beautiful place. Vincent just said it was a farm, same as any other. It was plain to see he was not a man for small talk. But Catherine understood something important right then. Vincent wasn't mean or cruel or dangerous. He was just quiet. Walled off, for sure, but not a threat. There was a gentleness tucked away beneath that silent armor. She'd seen it when he offered his coat, the way he had lit the lantern to give her light and comfort, and how he sat down to keep her company even when he didn't know what on earth to say. The downpour finally started to let up, turning from a flood to a steady drizzle. Vincent got to his feet, saying he had to see about getting the wagon out and finding her father. Catherine tried to tag along, but he flat out refused, telling her to stay put where it was warm and safe. Before she could even argue, he was gone. Catherine was left alone in that little shelter, wrapped up in his coat that smelled of a man and good, honest labor. Her head was spinning. Vincent Drummond was nothing like the man everyone talked about. He was a quiet kind of hero, a man of deeds instead of words, someone who had rescued a complete stranger without a thought for reward or even a thank you. He had not asked who she was before he dove into that rushing water. He had not cared if she was pretty or what her family name was. He just saw a person in trouble and he acted. Vincent came back about 20 minutes later. He was leading Star by the halter and the mare was soaked but just fine. The wagon was banged up, but he had managed to right it and drag it from the creek. It could be fixed, not today, but it was not a total loss. He said all this in a few short, direct sentences. Catherine tried again to thank him, with more feeling this time. Vincent just gave a short nod, looking like a man who'd rather wrestle a steer than take a compliment. He offered to take her on back to town. His horse was tied up nearby, a big, strong animal that could carry the both of them. Catherine said yes, not because she could not ride Star by herself, but because she figured this might be the only chance she would get to spend a little more time with him. Vincent helped her get on the horse first, then swung up behind her with the easy grace of a man who had spent his whole life in a saddle. He kept a respectful distance, but they were bound to be close. Catherine could feel the solid warmth of his body against her back, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, and could feel the sense of safety that just seemed to radiate from him. The ride back to town was a silent one. Vincent guided the horse with a sure hand, steering clear of the worst ruts in the muddy road. Star followed along behind them on a rope, quiet as a mouse. The drizzle kept on, painting the world in soft, blurry shades of green and gray. Catherine tried to start a conversation a couple of times, making a comment about how bad the storm had been. Vincent just made a neutral sound of agreement. She mentioned how lucky she was that he happened to be passing by. Vincent said that luck was a mighty strong word. He explained that he always took that road when he came down from his farm. She asked if he came down to town often. Vincent replied, "Not much." It was like trying to have a conversation with a rock. But Catherine did not mind. There was something peaceful about his silence. It was not an awkward silence or an angry one. It was just quiet. Vincent did not feel the need to fill the air with useless words. And after dealing with all the sweet-talking admirers who never stopped jabbering without ever saying anything important, that honest quiet was a welcome change. They rode into the village just as dusk was settling in. The windows of the houses were beginning to glow with the warm yellow light of oil lamps. Vincent stopped his horse right in front of Anthony Miller's general store. He slid off first, then reached up a hand to help Catherine down. She took it, feeling the callous strength in his large hand. Once her feet were back on solid ground, she tried one last time to thank him properly. She told him that he had saved her life, that she did not know how she could ever repay him, that she wanted to do something for him. Vincent finally looked her square in the eyes. There was an intensity in his gaze, something that made Catherine's heart start to beat a little faster in a way that had nothing to do with the cold or the scare she'd had. He told her he did not need any repayment. He said that any decent man would have done the same thing. Catherine replied, "No, not just anyone would have risked their own life that way." He had no answer for that. The door to the store flew open. Anthony Miller came rushing out, his face etched with worry. "Catherine!" He had been beside himself, wondering where she had gotten to in that awful storm. Mrs. Amelia was right on her husband's heels, looking just as frantic. Catherine tried to explain what had happened, but her mother cut her off, already pulling her toward the door, talking a mile a minute, fussing about her wet clothes and the risk of catching her death. When Catherine turned to wave goodbye to Vincent, he was already swinging up onto his horse. It was only then that Anthony Miller seemed to realize who had brought his daughter home. His whole face changed, a mix of surprise and something that looked a lot like caution. "Vincent Drummond," he said, his voice stiff and formal. Vincent just nodded his head. It was the smallest possible sign of acknowledgement. Anthony asked what had happened. Vincent laid it out in 3 quick sentences. The young lady's wagon turned over in the creek. He got her out of the water and brought her back. It was as simple as that. Anthony started to thank him, but Vincent was already turning his horse away. He said the wagon was at a shelter down by the creek, and that he should send someone to get it the next day. And with that, without another word, he rode off. Folks out on the street stopped what they were doing to watch, whispering to one another. Vincent Drummond and the lovely Catherine Miller. Now that was a pair you would never expect to see. The town grapevine would be buzzing before the sun was even up. Back in the house, Catherine changed while her mother heated water for a bath and made some hot tea. She told them the entire story, from her foolish choice to cross the creek to the terrifying rescue. Mrs. Amelia listened with a hand over her heart, horrified by how close her daughter had come to drowning. Anthony just listened quietly, a thoughtful look on his face. When Catherine described how kind and watchful Vincent had been, how he'd given her his own coat to keep her warm, how he'd lit the lantern and just sat with her until the storm broke, Anthony and Amelia shared a look that said 1,000 words. Catherine saw it and asked what that was all about. Her father shifted on his feet, finally saying that he was mighty grateful to Vincent for saving his daughter, but that he did not really know the man. Nobody did. The man had lived all by himself for years, did not talk to anybody, and had a reputation for being a hard man to get along with. "Hard," she repeated, feeling a spark of anger. The man had just saved her life without a second thought, and without asking for a single thing in return. He did not seem hard to her. He seemed decent. He seemed more real than all those smooth-talking fellas who came calling with their pretty words and empty promises. Mrs. Amelia started to say something about not judging a book by its cover, but Catherine cut her off, saying that was exactly what she was doing. She was not judging by how he looked, but by what he did. The conversation ended there, but Catherine could not get it out of her mind. That night, tucked into her bed under warm blankets, she played every moment over again. The strength in his hands as they pulled her from that current, the intensity of his dark eyes, the deep sound of his voice telling her she'd been brave, the easy silence on the ride home, and most of all, that last look he gave her before he left. A look filled with something she could not quite put a name to, but that made her heart give a little flutter. Vincent Drummond was not the man people said he was, and Catherine was determined to know the real him. The next few days were peculiar. The story of her rescue traveled through town faster than a prairie fire, picking up wilder details with every telling. Some folks said Catherine had nearly died. Others claimed Vincent had to swim against the current for 100 yards with her in his arms. A few even swore he had used a cowboy lasso to pull her from the water, which was just plain foolishness. But then gossip never did need to make much sense. The town's reaction was a mixed bag. Some praised Vincent's heroism, saying maybe he was not as bad as everyone thought. Others were suspicious, whispering about how strange it was that he was right there at that very moment, as if to suggest there was something fishy about it all. And then there were the ones who just did not know what to think. Vincent Drummond was still a puzzle the town just could not solve. As for Catherine, she was getting more attention than ever. People would stop by the general store just to hear the story straight from her. The women asked nosy questions about what it was like being so close to that mysterious rancher. The men, especially the ones she had turned down, made snide remarks about how lucky she was to be rescued by anybody, even if it was Vincent Drummond. She did not miss the scorn in their voices. John Thatcher, the blacksmith's boy and one of her most stubborn suitors, was especially foul. He showed up at the store 2 days later and made sure to talk loud enough for Catherine and the other customers to hear him. He remarked what a shame it was that a fine young woman like Catherine had to be indebted to a man like Vincent Drummond. He said it was an awkward spot to be in, and that she ought to be careful what kind of payment a lonely man might expect. Catherine felt her temper flare. She walked right up to John with a look that made the young man backpedal. She said, her voice steady but sharp as a tack, that Vincent expected nothing, that he had saved her life out of pure decency, and that John ought to be ashamed of himself for sullying the name of such an honorable man. The store went dead quiet. John stomped out, his face as red as a beet from the humiliation. The gossip got a whole new chapter. Catherine Miller standing up for Vincent Drummond. Now that was interesting. Catherine knew she had to thank him properly. Vincent's coat was still at her house, now dry and folded neatly. She decided to use it as an excuse. She spent the whole afternoon baking sweets, which were her specialty. She made coconut macaroons, butter cookies, and pumpkin candies. She packed it all up nice and neat in a basket lined with a clean cloth, placed the coat on top, and declared she was heading out to Wild Ridge Farm to return the man's things and give him a proper thank you. Well, Mrs. Amelia put her foot down right then and there. It simply was not proper for a young single woman to go calling on a bachelor way out at an isolated farm. What on earth would people say? Catherine shot back that folks were already gossiping, so it hardly mattered. She was not planning on doing anything improper, just delivering a thank you that was well-deserved. Her father stepped in, saying if Catherine was set on going, then he would go along with her. Catherine agreed, knowing it was the best deal she was going to get. The trip to Wild Ridge Farm took a good 2 hours. The wagon path snaked up into the hills, cutting through thick piney woods and opening up into wide fields where cattle were grazing. Catherine had to admit it was a beautiful stretch of country. The air was clean, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind, giving a sense of space and freedom she never felt in the small village. She could see why a man would choose to live out here. The farm itself was surprisingly well kept. Catherine had sort of pictured a run-down place, a mirror of the owner's own loneliness. But the fences were strung tight, the pastures were clear, and the main house, made of wood and stone, looked solid and cared for. It was not a grand mansion, but it was a sturdy working building. There were sheds for tools, a well-built corral, and even a little vegetable patch off to the side. Everything pointed to steady, capable hands at work. Vincent was out by the corral mending a fence when they rode up. His back was to them, but he heard the wagon and turned. For just a split second, Catherine saw genuine surprise on his face before that quiet, unreadable mask settled back into place. Vincent set down his tools and walked toward them with a steady pace. He gave Anthony a formal greeting, then his eyes landed on Catherine with something like a question in them. Catherine climbed down from the wagon, holding the basket, explaining she had come to bring back his coat and to thank him the right way. She held out the basket and said she had baked some things as a small token of her gratitude. You could see Vincent hesitate. For a moment it looked as if he might refuse. But then he took the basket gently, like a man who was not used to receiving presents. He said it was not necessary, but gave her a nod of thanks. A heavy silence hung in the air. Anthony tried to break it up with polite chit-chat about the farm, remarking on how well he kept the place. Vincent gave him short answers. Yes, he ran it all by himself. No, it was not so bad once you fell into a routine. Yes, the herd was healthy this year. The conversation just fizzled out with each reply. Catherine watched Vincent. He kept his eyes off her, directing all his attention to her father. His shoulders were tense, and he was clearly uncomfortable with the social visit. But she saw little, things that others might miss, like the careful way his fingers held the basket so he would not smash the pastries, or the way his eyes flickered over to her when he thought no one was looking. She even saw the muscles in his jaw soften just a bit when she smiled. Anthony finally said they did not want to take up any more of his time, and that they had just come to drop off the basket. Vincent thanked them again for the food, saying they should not have gone to all that trouble. Catherine replied that it was her pleasure and that she hoped he would enjoy them. For a brief but powerful second, their eyes met. Something passed between them, a small but unmistakable spark. Vincent was the first to look away, taking a small step back. Just as they were climbing back onto the wagon to head home, Catherine could not help herself. She turned and asked if Vincent planned on coming down to the village in the next few days. He looked taken aback by the question, but said maybe toward the end of the week. She told him it would be nice to see him, that she would like to talk some more if he had the time. Vincent did not reply. He just stood there holding the basket, his expression impossible to read, as their wagon pulled away. On the ride back, Anthony was quiet for a very long time. At last, he said in a measured voice that Vincent seemed like a decent, hard-working man, that the farm was in good order, and that spoke volumes about his character. But he added the man was also very reserved, very much a loner, and that Catherine needed to be careful. Careful of what? She asked. Anthony paused. Be careful about your expectations, he answered vaguely. Catherine knew what her father was really trying to say. He had seen her interest, and it worried him. Vincent Drummond was not what anyone would call a suitable match. He had no social life, no friends in the village, and he showed no desire to make any connections. He was a man who had chosen to be alone. Anthony was afraid his daughter would get her heart broken trying to get close to someone who did not want to be reached. But Catherine could not stop thinking about that last look they had shared. There was something there. She was positive. Something hidden deep beneath all that reserve. Vincent was not a man without feelings. She had seen it herself. She had seen real concern when he pulled her from that river. She had seen kindness when he gave her his coat. She had even seen something like warmth in his dark eyes today when she smiled at him. It was buried deep, shielded by years of living by himself, but it was there. And Catherine, for the very first time in her life, felt a true connection to someone. It was not a shallow admiration based on looks, nor a calculated interest based on what she could gain. It was a deep-down recognition, as if a part of her saw a part of him and called out to it. The feeling was new, a little scary, and very exciting. She made up her mind right then and there on the ride back, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, that she was not going to give up. Vincent Drummond deserved to be truly known, to have someone who could see past his unfair reputation, and Catherine wanted to be that person. The next few days were a true test of her patience. Catherine waited for the weekend, hoping that Vincent would actually come into the village like he said he might. She kept catching herself peering out the store window every time she heard the sound of a horse on the road. Her mother noticed her restlessness and gave her knowing looks but did not say anything. John Thatcher showed up again, trying to pick up his courting where he left off, but Catherine treated him so coldly that he finally seemed to understand the message and stopped coming by. Saturday finally came. Catherine woke up earlier than usual, helped open the store, and kept a watchful eye. The day dragged on, with each hour feeling like 3. She started to think Vincent was not coming, that maybe he had changed his mind, or that his maybe was just a polite way of saying no. It was already getting dark when she heard Mrs. Matilda remark to another shopper that she had seen Vincent Drummond leaving old Gonzalo's warehouse with sacks of feed. Catherine's heart did a little jump. He was in the village. She waited, making herself act casual and go about her work as usual. A few minutes later, the bell on the store door jingled. Vincent came in and stopped for a second when he spotted her. Surprise flashed across his face before that familiar neutral look returned. Catherine smiled, feeling a flutter in her stomach that was an entirely new sensation. "It is good to see you," she said, hoping her voice sounded steady. Vincent just nodded and mumbled a quiet hello. He had his usual handwritten list, but this time, instead of just setting it on the counter and waiting, he handed it right into Catherine's hand. For a moment, their fingers touched. Catherine seized the opportunity, mentioning that she hoped he had enjoyed the baked goods. Vincent confirmed that he had, that they were good. She asked him which one was his favorite. He paused, clearly not prepared for a conversation, but he answered, "The coconut macaroons." It was not much, but it was a start. As Catherine gathered the items on his list, she used every second to ask simple questions. How were his cattle? Did he finish mending that fence? Had the weather been good enough to get work done? Vincent answered in short sentences, but he did answer. He did not try to leave. And Catherine realized something vital. He did not seem bothered by her questions, just unused to them. When she had everything gathered up and he had paid, she took a chance. She said her father had mentioned how impressive the farm was, that it was amazing he managed it all on his own. Vincent's lips quirked into something like a smile. It was small and a bit crooked, but it was definitely a smile. He said it was honest work. She agreed, adding that honest work says a lot about a man. There was a pause. Vincent picked up his packages but did not leave right away. He lingered for an extra moment as if he wanted to say something more but did not know how. Finally, he murmured, "Thank you." It was not just for the supplies, but for seeing him. He added that he was not used to that. Catherine told him he should be, that what he did by saving her was an extraordinary thing. Vincent shook his head and said he only did what was right. And there it was again. That raw honesty, that refusal to take credit, that complete genuineness that all the polished and scheming suitors she knew had never possessed. Catherine held his gaze for a long moment. Vincent did not look away this time. Something was growing between them, a fragile but real connection. Then he blinked, breaking the contact, mumbled a goodbye, and walked out. Catherine stood there, her heart beating fast, with a smile she could not control on her face. Mrs. Matilda, who had been watching the entire exchange with great interest, commented just loud enough for her to hear that this was a very interesting turn of events. Catherine paid her no mind. She did not care about town gossip. For the first time in 26 years, she felt that spark everyone talks about when they speak of true love. and she was not about to let it go out. Vincent Drummond might not know it yet, but she was determined to know him, to truly see him, to prove he was worthy of being noticed, of having a connection, some warmth, and maybe even a little love. And Catherine, that warm-hearted woman everyone looked up to but nobody really understood, had at last found a man worth the trouble. The finest love story in the valley was just getting started. The weeks that came after were filled with a quiet change. Catherine didn't make a big show of it, didn't announce her plans to a soul. Instead, she started building a bridge to him with a kind of patience that would have shocked anyone who only knew her on the surface. She knew Vincent was not the kind of man you could win over with bold moves or grand gestures. He was a fortress, built one stone at a time over many years, and the only way in was the same way, slow and steady, with respect, proving her presence was not a threat. Vincent began to mosey on down to the village a little more often. Not every single week, but maybe every 10 days or so, and sometimes even sooner. He always made his way to the miller's store for his supplies. And he always found Catherine behind the counter, almost like she had a sixth sense telling her exactly when he would show up. And every single time, they would swap a few more words than were needed just to buy and sell. They were just little bits of conversation, scraps that another person might think were nothing at all. Catherine would ask about his farm, and Vincent would answer with short but truthful details. He'd mentioned that winter seemed to be coming on early that year. She'd remarked that her mother was putting up extra preserves because of it. He said one of his horses had a limp. She suggested an herbal tea her own father used for swelling. They were simple little talks, but each one was like a stone being laid for a bridge between two mighty different worlds. And then there were those moments, those little seconds that hung in the air and said more than any words could. It was when Vincent would hand over the money to pay, and his rough fingers would just brush against hers, staying there for half a beat longer than they had to. It was when Catherine would laugh at something, and the hardness in Vincent's eyes would soften, almost turning into a smile. It was when she would catch him just watching her as she sorted goods, and he would look away real quick but not quite quick enough. It was when he would walk in, and before even saying hello, his eyes would search for her, as if he just needed to make sure she was there. The village took notice, of course. St. Sebastian's Valley was far too small a place to keep a secret. The town gossips started working overtime. They said Catherine was lowering her standards, wasting her beauty on a man who could barely string two words together. They whispered that Vincent was just taking advantage of her being grateful for the rescue. They declared it was just a passing fancy, and soon enough Catherine would come to her senses and pick one of the more proper fellas who were trying to win her over. But Catherine didn't come to her senses. In fact, she walked even further down that path that only she seemed to be able to see. She began showing up, real casual-like, in places where she knew Vincent was likely to be. When he went to Old Man Gonzalo's warehouse, she would just happen to be buying fabric at the shop right next door. When he stopped by the blacksmith to get new horseshoes, she would appear with a basket of bread her mother had sent over for the blacksmith's wife. It was never pushy, never too obvious, but it was constant. She became a gentle and steady presence in his life. At first, Vincent was clearly confused by it all. He was not used to anyone seeking him out or wanting his company. The first few times Catherine just appeared out of the blue, he would stiffen up, almost like he was on the defense, like a lone critter that suddenly finds another creature has moved into its territory. But she never pushed him. She would greet him, give him a smile, say a few light words, and then be on her way. She never demanded his attention. She just offered her company. It was on a morning in May, when the air had a serious bite to it, that the first real shift happened. Catherine was on her way back from visiting Mrs. Lucinda, taking the very same road that had led to her rescue months before. This time there was no storm, just a clear, cold morning with frost covering the fields like they were dusted with sugar. She saw Vincent up ahead, fixing a fence near the road, working by himself with that steady way he had. Catherine pulled the wagon to a stop. Vincent heard the sound and looked up, and you could see the surprise on his face. She climbed down with a basket her mother always sent with her when she visited someone, and she walked right over to him. "I brought hot coffee and some bread that's still warm," she said with a smile. "I thought you might like something to warm you up a bit." Vincent paused, his tools still in his hands, and you could see him fighting with himself, torn between taking the kindness and keeping his safe distance. Kindness won. They sat together on a big rock by the fence. Vincent drank his coffee without a word, but Catherine saw the tiny, almost invisible sigh of comfort he let out when the hot liquid went down his throat. She did not try to fill the quiet with a lot of chatter. She just sat there with him, enjoying the morning, the clean air, and the sight of the hills off in the distance. It was Vincent who spoke first. He thanked her for the coffee and said it was good. She smiled and said, "The cold weather called for it." Then he asked, his tone making it sound like a question he had been holding on to for a long time, "Why do you do this?" Catherine knew exactly what he was really asking. "Why do I seek you out? Why do I keep trying when anyone else would have already given up?" She chose her words carefully before she answered. She said he interested her, that she saw something in him that other people did not see. She said that he had saved her life without asking for anything in return, and that one act said more about his character than years of fancy talk could ever say about other men. Vincent was quiet for a long while, just staring at the coffee cup in his calloused hands. At last, he said, his voice lower than usual, that she did not know anything about him, that people had their reasons for keeping him at arm's length. Catherine replied that if that was true, then he should tell her. He should let her know the real him, not the version she heard in town gossip, but the man himself. Vincent lifted his head and his eyes met hers. There was an old pain in them, something he had held on to for so long, it had become part of his very bones. And then, maybe because the cold morning needed some human warmth, or maybe because all those years of silence had finally become too heavy a burden to carry all by himself, Vincent started to talk. He told her there was no dark secret that kept him away. There was no big betrayal or some terrible tragedy in his past. It was something quieter and sadder. He had just always been a man of few words, always more comfortable with hard work than with social talk. Ever since he was a boy, he had preferred the company of animals and the land over people. When his father passed and left him the farm, Vincent was 26 years old. He tried for a while to be a part of village life. He went to the parties, the dances, and the church socials, but he never seemed to fit in. He never knew how to talk about the right things. He did not understand the rules of polite society that everyone else just seemed to know. He was too direct, too serious, and way too quiet. The young women stayed away from him because he did not know how to give them pretty compliments. The other men thought he was odd because he would rather leave early than stay up drinking and telling stories into the night. The whispers started soon after, that he was unfriendly, that he was arrogant, that he thought he was better than everyone else, that something was just plain wrong with him. Vincent tried to ignore it at first, but it was like a slow poison, eating away at him with every sideways glance, every conversation that stopped dead when he walked up, every invitation that he never received. He came to realize that people were judging him not for what he did, but for what he did not do, for not smiling enough, for not talking enough, for simply being different. The final straw had come years before when he had tried to court a young woman. Vincent never said her name, and Catherine knew better than to ask. He told her he had thought she was different, that she understood him. He spent months working up the courage to speak to her father, to ask for permission to officially court her. When he finally did it, the girl's father laughed. He actually laughed right in his face. He said his daughter deserved a man with a future, with some ambition, not some hermit farmer who could barely hold a civilized conversation. He told Vincent he ought to be ashamed for even thinking he would be a good enough match. Vincent never tried again. He decided right then and there that if people did not want him, then he sure as heck did not need them. He went back to Wild Ridge Farm, and he stayed there. He built a life that did not rely on anyone's approval or acceptance. He worked hard, he tended to the land, he sold his cattle, he bought what he needed, and he returned to the solitude he had chosen for himself. It was a lonesome life, he admitted to her, but at least it was an honest one. He did not have to pretend to be someone he was not. He did not have to put up with judging eyes or hateful whispers. When he finished his story, a heavy silence hung in the air. Catherine felt a hot anger burn deep in her chest. and anger at the thoughtless cruelty of people, at how they had judged a good man just because he was not like them. She said, and her voice was full of emotion, that father was a fool, that there was nothing wrong with Vincent for being a quiet man. It meant he was genuine. She told him she would choose a man of honest deeds 1,000 times over 100 men full of pretty, empty words. Vincent just looked at her, and his expression was something Catherine could not quite figure out. There was surprise in his eyes, but there was something else, something deeper. Maybe it was vulnerability, as if her words had found a crack in the high walls he had built around himself. He asked her why she was so different from all the others, why she did not see him the way everyone else did. Catherine answered that maybe it was because she had also spent her whole life being seen the wrong way. People looked at her and only saw a pretty face. They wanted to have her like she was some fancy decoration for their home. Not a single one of them ever bothered to care about what she thought or dreamed or felt. Vincent, she said, was the first man who seemed to be truly indifferent to her looks, and funnily enough, that made him more interesting than all those other men combined. There was a moment of deep. It was a silent connection, but a powerful one. Here were two people, both misunderstood in their own way, finally finding someone who saw them for who they were. Vincent said, his voice barely a whisper, that she deserved a whole lot better than a quiet farmer with a tarnished name. Catherine just smiled, a little sad but with a fire in her eyes, and told him she would be the one to decide what she deserved. Thank you kindly for listening. If you are enjoying this story of true love, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the powerful conclusion. They each went their separate ways that day, but something deep down had shifted. The wall between them had not crumbled completely, but it sure had a big crack running through it now, and through that crack, a little bit of light was starting to shine. In the weeks that followed, Vincent stopped running. He was still a man of few words, mind you. But when Catherine came around, he did not pull away, pull. They started to talk more. He told her about his farm, about the hard work of doing it all alone, and about his dreams of making the pasture bigger. She told him about the general store, the funny things customers would say, and the book she was borrowing from the school teacher. These were real conversations, not just empty words to fill the quiet. And then the small gestures started. Catherine brought him food more often, always with a good reason. Oh, we had too much bread left over at the store. It would be a sin to throw it away. My mother made a little extra stew. It would be a shame not to share it. These sweets did not sell today. Would Vincent like to have them? He started accepting with a gratitude that grew each time, and he began to give back in his own way. He would bring her fresh eggs from his hens or show up with wild honey he had found out in the woods. One time he brought her a handful of wildflowers, a gesture so surprising it made Catherine's heart do a little flip. The whole village watched this unfold with a mix of curiosity and scorn. The older women would shake their heads and gossip that Catherine was losing her way. The men made cruel jokes about Vincent not knowing his place, but the loudest voice against them was John Thatcher. The blacksmith's son had not taken her refusal kindly, and seeing Catherine show interest in the one man nobody in the region wanted was like a slap in the face. John began a quiet but steady campaign to ruin Vincent's name, digging up old stories and blowing them out of proportion, and making up new ones when he needed to. He said Vincent had terrible fits of rage, that he would break things when he got upset. He hinted that animals on his farm had a strange way of dying. He claimed Vincent scared off any man who tried to work for him with his mean temper. None of it was true, of course, but a rumor does not need truth to do its harm. Catherine heard all these tales, and every single one just made her more determined. She knew Vincent now, or at least she was starting to. She knew that underneath all that quiet, he was a gentle soul. She knew he was an honest man who worked hard and cared for his land and his animals. She knew he had been hurt before and was just trying to protect himself from more pain. And she knew, with a certainty that grew every day, that she was falling in love with him. Everything came to a head one afternoon in late June. Catherine was working in the store when John walked in with two of his friends. You could tell they had been drinking, even though it was the middle of the day. John came right up to the counter where Catherine stood, leaned on it heavy, and started talking loud enough for everyone to hear. He said it was a crying shame to see a pretty and smart girl like her wasting her time on a man who did not even know how to treat a lady. He called Vincent Drummond a savage, saying he was more animal than man, living all alone up in those hills like some kind of wolf. He said Catherine was dirtying herself just by being seen with him, dragging her family's good name through the mud. He said she ought to be ashamed, turning down decent men to chase after that creature. A hot anger boiled up inside Catherine. It was not just because he was insulting her. It was the sheer injustice of his words against Vincent. She stood up straight, her eyes flashing like lightning, and said in a clear, firm voice that cut right through the store's chatter that John should be the one who is ashamed, talking that way about a man who was worth 10 times what he was. She said Vincent was an honest, hard-working, and decent man, qualities John clearly did not have. She told him if anyone in that store was behaving like an animal, it was John, drunk and disrespectful in the middle of the afternoon. The store went dead silent. John's face turned beet red from a mix of rage and shame. He mumbled something ugly, a word a decent man should never say in front of a woman. Anthony Miller, who had been in the back stockroom, heard the commotion and came out in a hurry. He ordered John to get out immediately, telling him he would not have that kind of foul talk in his place of business. John stumbled out, but not before he shot back a threat, saying Catherine would be sorry for choosing the wrong side. That night felt heavy and long. Catherine could not stop thinking about how unfair it all was. Vincent was judged just for being different, and now she was being attacked for simply standing by him. Her mother, Mrs. Amelia, tried to talk to her, with real worry in her eyes. She asked if Catherine was sure about the path she was taking. She said it was not about Vincent himself, but that her daughter needed to think about the price she would pay for being with someone so cut off from everyone else. Catherine told her mother she understood her concern, but for the first time in her whole life, she was following her heart instead of what other people expected. She said that Vincent saw her as a person, not as some prize to be won. She saw him as a good, complicated man, not the monster people made him out to be. And if the village did not like it, well, that was the village's problem, not hers. Mrs. Amelia sighed, but did not press the matter. She recognized that stubborn streak. It was the same one she had when she was young, when she chose Anthony over her own family's wishes. 2 days later, Vincent showed up in the village. Catherine was in the store organizing some shelves when she heard someone call her name from the street. She went outside and saw Vincent standing there, looking more tense than she had ever seen him. He asked if they could talk somewhere private. Catherine agreed right away and walked with him to a small patio on the side of the store. Vincent told her he had heard what happened with John Thatcher. News travels fast in a small town, and someone had told him the whole story. He looked troubled in a way that twisted her heart. He said he never wanted to cause her any trouble, and that he would understand if she wanted to keep her distance from now on. He said he would not hold it against her, that maybe it would be better for her in the long run. He was used to being alone anyway, he said. Catherine felt her chest tighten. Here he was, trying to push her away to protect her, willing to give up the only real human connection he had made in years. It was so like him, so noble and so heartbreakingly lonely. She took a step closer to him, closing the small space between them. She told him that he did not get to make that decision for her. She was a grown woman, and she would choose her own friends. She said that she did not care one bit about gossip or what anyone else thought. What she cared about, she said, was him. Those last words came out softer, more vulnerable than she intended. Vincent stood there, perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers. Catherine could see a war going on inside him. It was there in the tightness of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. Fear was fighting with hope. The need to protect was fighting desire. And the safety of being alone was fighting against the risk of letting someone in. At last, with a slow, hesitant motion, Vincent reached out his hand. He was not offering it for a formal handshake. He was just offering it. Catherine knew what it meant. It was an invitation. It was an admission. It was a surrender. She put her hand in his. She felt its warmth and strength, and the slight tremble that told her just how much that simple touch cost him. Vincent's voice was hoarse when he said he did not know how to do this, how to have someone in his life, how to be the man she deserved. Catherine squeezed his hand, smiling through the tears that suddenly stung her eyes. She told him they would figure it out together. She said he did not have to be perfect, he just had to be real. And he, more than anyone she had ever met, was absolutely real. They just stood there for a moment, holding hands, as the world kept turning around them. It was a small thing, something you could easily miss if you blinked. But for those two, it was everything. It was a choice. It was a promise. It was the start of something that would change them both in ways they could not even begin to guess. When they finally let go, there was a new understanding between them. They were not just acquaintances anymore. They were not just friends. They were something more, something that did not have a name yet, but it was there, and you could not deny it. Vincent said he had to get back to the farm. Catherine asked when she would see him again. He answered with the ghost of a smile that made her heart beat a little faster. He said soon, sooner than usual. And he was a man of his word. Vincent started showing up more and more, not just to buy supplies, but sometimes just to see her. He would wait outside the store until she had a quiet moment in her work. They would talk right there on the sidewalk as the town went on about its business. People watched them and whispered, but Catherine did not care anymore. And Vincent, slowly but surely, was learning not to care either. One afternoon, he saw her coming back from a delivery and offered her a ride on his wagon. They rode along together, talking about anything and everything. She told him all about a book she was reading, a story about adventures in faraway places. He listened with real interest, asking smart questions that showed her he was truly hearing what she said. When they got to her house, there was a long pause. They just looked at each other, and for a heartbeat, Catherine thought he was going to kiss her. He did not, but the fact that he almost did was almost as strong. There was the morning she took some fresh-baked bread out to the farm and found Vincent up on the shed, fixing the roof. She just stood there and watched for a bit, admiring the skill in his movements and the strength in a body shaped by years of hard work. When he climbed down and saw her standing there, the smile that flickered across his face was quick, but it changed everything. It made him look years younger, less weathered by his loneliness. Then there was the night of the full moon when she was closing up the store. He just appeared, saying he saw her light was still on and wanted to make sure everything was all right. They stood there in the doorway, washed in silvery light, talking in low voices so they would not wake the neighbors. Vincent told her about the stars and how he used them to find his way when he had to travel at night. Catherine told him about her mother teaching her how to sew by the light of an oil lamp. They were just small things, little pieces of themselves they were sharing with each other. And then there were the touches, always quick, always proper, but happening more and more often. Hands that would brush when passing something, shoulders that would graze when they walked next to each other. One time when Catherine stumbled on a loose rock, Vincent caught her by the waist to steady her. They stood there just a heartbeat longer than was proper, close enough for Catherine to feel the warmth of him, to see the little specks of gold in his dark eyes, and to notice how his gaze dropped to her lips for just a second before looking away. Anyone with eyes could see the change in Vincent. He had not suddenly become the life of the party, but his sharp edges were starting to soften. He would give other folks in town a quick nod and no longer shied away from conversations he had to have. He even helped old Mr. Boniface with some heavy sacks one time, a simple kindness that caught the old man, who had always given him a wide berth, completely by surprise. Catherine knew it was because Vincent was learning again that not everyone was cruel, that there was some good in the world if you just let it in. But the trouble had not gone away. John Thatcher, in particular, grew more and more bitter. He would make sour comments whenever he saw Catherine and looked at Vincent with a hatred he hardly tried to hide. One afternoon, he stood right in Vincent's way at the warehouse entrance, muttering something about how some men ought to know their place. Vincent did not say a word, just turned on his heel and walked off. But Catherine, who saw the whole thing, marched right up to John. She told him he was being pathetic and that he should focus on his own life instead of being so bitter about hers. Things finally came to a head one hot afternoon in July. Catherine was heading home from a friend's house when John showed up, clearly drunk again. He backed her into a corner with his words, saying awful things about how she was throwing her life away, and how she was too blind to see that Vincent would never be a proper man for her, that she was making a fool of herself in front of the whole town. Catherine tried to walk past him, but John grabbed her arm. He was not violent, just clumsy and insistent from the drink. That is when Vincent appeared. He was coming from the other direction, likely on his way back from some business. He saw what was happening, and something inside him just snapped. He crossed the street in 3 long strides, clamped down on John's wrist with a grip that made the younger man cry out in pain, and let go of Catherine in an instant. Vincent spoke in a low voice, but it was filled with a threat Catherine had never heard before. He told John he would never touch her again, never speak to her again, and never even look in her direction again. He said if he did, Vincent would personally make sure he lived to regret it. There was real violence coiled up in his words, not an empty boast, but the dead certainty of a man who knew how to use his strength when he had to. John's face went pale. He stammered some apologies and stumbled away. Catherine just stood there, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from something much more complicated. Vincent turned to her, his anger replaced by concern, and asked if she was all right, if John had hurt her. She told him she was fine, that he had gotten there just in time, and she thanked him. Vincent just shook his head and said there was no need for thanks, that protecting her was. He stopped right there and did not finish his sentence, but he did not need to. Catherine understood. Protecting her was an instinct for him, a need, something he would do without a second thought. They walked toward her house together. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. They stopped in front of the store, both of them hesitant. There was something in the air between them, a charge that had been building for weeks and was finally ready to spark. Vincent said he did not like the idea of John or anyone else giving her a hard time. Catherine replied that he could not always be there to protect her. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, like he was weighing each word, that he wished he could be. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. She looked up and met his eyes. He went on, his voice low but steady, saying he did not know when it happened. He said he tried to fight it because he figured it would be better for her, but he just could not deny it any longer. He told her she had become too important to him. He said he thought about her all the time. He said the farm, which used to be his safe place, now just felt empty when he went home alone. He said that he felt something for her he had never felt for anyone before. It was not some flowery speech from a poetry book. There were no fancy promises or romantic words. It was just the plain, honest truth from a man who did not know how to lie or dress things up, and that is what made it perfect. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes, but they were happy tears. She said she felt it too. She said she'd been feeling it for a good while, maybe since the rescue, or maybe since she first saw the real kindness in him when everyone else just saw a hard man. Vincent raised his hand, hesitant at first, and then touched her cheek as gently as a feather. The gesture was so tender, so respectful, coming from hands that were so strong and calloused. He told her she deserved better than what he could give her, but if she wanted him, if she truly wanted him, he would try. He would try to be the man she needed. He would try to be worthy of her. Catherine pressed his hand to her face and told him he already was, that he did not need to be anyone but himself. And then, right there, under a sky brushed with the colors of sunset, Vincent leaned down and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, almost shy, his lips pressing against hers carefully, as if she were something precious and fragile. Catherine kissed him back, her hands moving up to his broad shoulders, making the kiss a little deeper. Vincent made a low sound in his throat and wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss stayed gentle, but it held a promise of more. a promise of a future, of everything they had both been looking for without even knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing a little faster. Vincent rested his forehead against hers with his eyes closed. He said he did not know how this would work, how they could make it with the whole town set against them. Catherine replied, "They would find a way." She said when two people truly care for each other, everything else is just noise. Vincent smiled, a real, full smile that lit up his whole face. He said she made everything feel possible. They stayed like that for another moment or two before Catherine knew she had to go inside. Her parents were probably starting to worry. Vincent walked her to the door. He said goodbye with a promise to see her soon, but they both knew something important had changed between them. They were not just two acquaintances anymore, trying to figure out a strange connection. They were something new, something fragile but real, something worth fighting for. Inside the house, Mrs. Amelia and Anthony were waiting. They saw the look on their daughter's face, the sparkle in her eyes, and they knew. Amelia let out a sigh, but then she smiled. She asked if Catherine was sure about this. Catherine said she was more sure of this than anything in her entire life. Anthony looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod. He said Vincent seemed like an honorable man. He said if Vincent made his daughter happy, then he had his blessing. But he added that their road would not be an easy one, that it would take the town a long time to come around. Catherine told him she did not care, that she had learned that what other people think is not worth a thing compared to what you know is true in your own heart. That night, lying in her bed, Catherine could hardly sleep. She could still feel the warmth of the kiss, the strength of Vincent's arms, and the feeling of finally being right where she belonged. She thought about how strange life could be. Just a few months ago, she was tired of turning down one suitor after another, thinking she would never find a real connection. And then a storm rolled in, a wagon tipped over, and the one man everyone avoided became her hero in more ways than just one. Vincent had not only saved her life, but he had also shown her the kind of love that was worth waiting for. It was a love built on actions, not just pretty words. It was a love that saw past the surface to what was really inside. It was a love built on the solid ground of respect and admiration for one another. It was true love, the rare and precious kind. And somewhere up in the mountains at Wild Ridge Farm, Vincent was not sleeping either. He stared up at the dark ceiling of the quiet house that had been his own prison for years, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt hope. Catherine Miller, the most respected woman in town, had chosen him. Not in spite of who he was, but because of it. She saw right through his tough reputation and found the real man underneath. And that man, to his own surprise, was worthy of being loved. Their journey was not over. In fact, it was just getting started. But they both knew with a quiet certainty that every hard day ahead would be worth it, because true love always is. The months that came after that first kiss were a time of learning and growing. Catherine and Vincent built their relationship on their own terms, paying no mind to the social rules that other couples followed so strictly. There were no constant chaperones on their visits, no formal courtship that followed the old traditions. Instead, there was just honesty. Vincent started coming down to the village more often. When he did, he would spend hours just talking with Catherine on the porch of the store, or they would walk through the streets as the sun went down. He took her to see Wild Ridge Farm the right way. He showed her the fields where his cattle grazed, the clear creek that wound its way through the property, and the breathtaking view from the top of the ridge that gave the place its name. Catherine saw the quiet pride in his eyes when he pointed out the fences he had mended, the pastures he had brought back to life, and all the improvements he had made by himself over the years. She understood that Vincent's work was his way of talking, that every sturdy fence post was a statement of his character, and every healthy animal was proof of his dedication. And Catherine brought him into her world too. Vincent started staying for supper at the Miller house. He was stiff and awkward at first, but he slowly started to relax with Mrs. Amelia's warm welcome and the easy conversations with Anthony. They found out Vincent knew a great deal about raising cattle, enough to impress even Anthony, who had been dealing with farmers for decades. They found out he had a dry sense of humor that would pop up when you least expected it, making them all laugh. They found out that underneath that quiet exterior was a good and complex and a right interesting man. But folks in St. Sebastian's Valley were not ready to see it that way. What started as quiet whispers soon turned into loud, open remarks. The women of the village, especially the older ones, thought it was a pure scandal. Catherine Miller, the prettiest girl in the county, was throwing her life away on a man who was not her equal. They said he must have put a spell on her, that she was not in her right mind, that being grateful for the rescue had clouded her thinking. They said Vincent had taken advantage of her, manipulated a sweet young girl, and that he had some other plans up his sleeve. The men were even worse. They saw Vincent as an outsider who had won the prize none of them could get. John Thatcher was the ringleader of the loudest bunch, spreading poison every chance he got. He made up stories about Vincent being a violent man, saying he had dark secrets hidden away at his farm. He told everyone Catherine would wake up one day and see her mistake, but by then it would be too late. The campaign to ruin his name was ugly, and it never stopped. There was an incident back in August. Vincent was at the general store buying supplies when a group of men, John included, walked in. They started talking real loud about how some folks just do not understand when they are not welcome, about how some people do not have the decency to stay where they belong. Vincent paid them no mind, finished his shopping with that steady calm of his, and left without giving them the satisfaction. But later, Catherine saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way he clenched his jaw. It took a lot out of him to keep his cool like that. She tried to make him feel better later, telling him that what those people thought did not matter one bit. Vincent agreed with her, but she could tell it stung him more than he let on. Not because he had any doubts about himself, but because he was worried it would eventually start to hurt Catherine. He told her he did not want her to be cast out on his account, that maybe they ought to be a little more private. Catherine flat out refused. She said she would not hide, that she was not ashamed of how they felt. She believed the more they reacted to the gossip, the more power they gave it. It was a brave choice, but it came with a price. A few customers started avoiding the store when they knew Catherine was working. The invitations to social get-togethers from the other girls in the village just stopped coming. One family even made it clear they did not approve and said Catherine was setting a bad example. Mrs. Amelia suffered in silence, not because she was against her daughter, but because it pained her to see her daughter hurt by the cruelty of others. But for every person who turned away, there were others who showed their support in quiet ways. Mrs. Lucinda, an old family friend, said out loud that Vincent seemed like a good man, and that Catherine was right to follow her heart. Mr. Boniface mentioned he always thought the stories about Vincent were overblown, and that a hard-working, honest young man deserved a chance. Even the priest, wise man who knew everybody in the valley, brought it up in a sermon. He talked about not judging a book by its cover, about how things are not always what they seem, and about the kindness you can find in the most unexpected places. The bond between Catherine and Vincent only got stronger, no matter what people on the outside thought. They really knew each other now, well past first impressions, and that first spark. Catherine found out that Vincent loved to read, that he had a small collection of books at his farm, that he would read over and over again on lonely nights. He found out she dreamed of traveling one day, of seeing the ocean and places beyond the mountains. She discovered he played the harmonica, an instrument his father had taught him, though he hardly ever played it for anyone. He discovered she painted with watercolors when she had a spare moment. She painted little landscapes that she kept hidden, feeling shy about them. They shared their private fears, too. Catherine admitted that she sometimes doubted herself, that after years of being seen only for her looks, she wondered if she had anything else to offer. Vincent told her with absolute certainty that she was the most interesting person he had ever met, that her beauty was just a small thing compared to her smarts, her kindness, and her courage. Vincent admitted he was scared he would eventually let her down, that one day she would wake up and realize she had made a mistake by choosing him. Catherine took his face in her hands and said the only way he could disappoint her would be if he gave up. She told him she chose him for exactly who he was, and that choice was as solid as a rock. Their kisses became more common and more passionate. They were still proper and respectful, but they were filled with a growing desire and the promise of a life together. They spent afternoons at the farm, holding each other under the shade of an old oak tree, talking about their plans. Vincent mentioned very carefully that the main house could be made bigger, that there was plenty of room to add on. Catherine understood what he was really asking without him having to say the words. She smiled and replied that she had always liked houses with big porches where a person could sit and watch the sunset. It was a strange courtship by the village's standards, but it was theirs. It was real and honest, built on a strong foundation of respect and true love, and they both knew it was leading to something permanent. Vincent had not officially proposed yet, but it was just a matter of time. He wanted to make sure everything was just right, that he could give her the life she deserved. It was in September when things were about to come to a head. The village held a dance every year, a spring celebration that the whole community attended. Catherine usually went, more because she was expected to than because she wanted to. This year she asked Vincent if he would go with her. He hesitated. You could see it on his face. He was not one for parties, and he hated crowds. But he looked at her, saw the hope in her eyes, and he agreed. The news that Vincent Drummond was going to be at the dance spread like a wildfire. In the days leading up to it, you could cut the tension with a knife. Some folks said it was going to be a disaster, that there was bound to be a confrontation. Others were just plain curious, wanting to see how it would all play out. John Thatcher and his buddies made comments under their breath about how some people had the nerve to show up where they were not wanted. The night of the ball finally came. Catherine wore her finest dress, a pale blue one that brought out the color of her eyes. Mrs. Amelia helped her put her hair up, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face. When Vincent came to pick her up, he looked obviously uncomfortable in clothes that were fancier than he was used to. But he was there. He had come for her, facing a situation he clearly hated, all because he knew it was important to her. They walked into the hall together. For just a second, the music stopped. All the chatter died down. Every single eye in the place turned to them. It was a moment so dramatic it felt like it was from a play, but it was real. Vincent and Catherine standing together, silently challenging the judgment of the entire town. Then the music started back up. The conversations began again, but quieter now, with everyone watching them out of the corner of their eye. Vincent stood stiffly beside Catherine, clearly a fish out of water. She squeezed his hand and whispered that everything was all right. They did not have to stay for long. They got some drinks and stood on the edge of the hall, just watching the others dance. A few people came over to say hello to Catherine, but they ignored Vincent completely. Others just made a point to stay away. It was Mrs. Lucinda who broke the ice. The old woman marched right over to them, greeted Vincent with a warm smile, thanked him for taking such good care of Catherine, and said it was a good thing to see a young, happy couple. Her public approval meant something. Other older, respected folks followed her lead. Before long, a small group was talking with them, and Vincent, though you could tell he was still uneasy, answered their questions politely. Then the band started playing a waltz. Catherine looked at Vincent with hopeful eyes. He shook his head just a little and said he did not know how to dance. She smiled and told him she would teach him. He hesitated for a moment, but he could not say no to her. They went to the middle of the floor, and Catherine gently guided him. Vincent was clumsy at first, stepping all over his own feet, but he had a natural rhythm and soon found the beat of the music. As they danced, Catherine saw the whole world around them just fade away in his eyes. In that moment, it was just the two of them. John Thatcher watched them from across the room, his face twisted with anger and jealousy. He was drinking heavily, surrounded by his friends who just fueled his bitterness. When the song ended, Vincent and Catherine stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. John saw his chance. He followed them out, stumbling a little as a bit. Catherine saw it first, and the look on his face made her stomach clench up like a fist. Vincent felt her go tense and turned his head. John had stopped just a few feet away. His eyes were glassy, fixed hard on Vincent. He slurred his words, thick with drink, saying it was mighty brave of Vincent to even show his face there, to act like he belonged, to pretend he was good enough for a woman like Catherine. Vincent didn't say a word, just shifted so he was standing a little bit in front of her. But John kept on, the poison dripping from his tongue now. He said, "Everybody in this town knows the truth, that Vincent was nothing, had nothing to his name. That one day Catherine would wake up and see she'd wasted her best years on him, and it'd be too late. That she deserved a better man, someone with a future, who could give her the life she was meant to have. Now, if you believe true love is about seeing the heart of a person, not the size of their wallet, then give this a like so this story can reach more people." Catherine took a step, ready to fight for Vincent like she always did, but he put a gentle hand on her arm to stop her. For the first time since he'd known John, Vincent spoke. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of years of being quiet. He said John was right about one thing. Catherine did deserve better. She deserved a man who saw her for who she was on the inside, not just for her pretty face. She deserved to be loved for her good heart, her sharp mind, and her courage, not just for a beauty that other men wanted to own. He cleared his throat. She deserved someone who would choose her every single day, not because it was easy or made him look good, but because a life without her would be nothing but an empty room. Vincent kept talking, his eyes locked on John, but his words were meant for the whole crowd that was starting to gather. He said he couldn't offer her riches or a high standing in town. He couldn't promise a life without struggle or that everyone would approve. But he could offer her pure, simple honesty. He could offer a faithfulness that would never break. He could offer a love built on a solid foundation of respect and real admiration. He offered her a life where she would be his partner, not just some pretty thing on his arm. A life where her thoughts mattered, where her dreams had wings, and where she would always be free to be exactly the woman she was meant to be. And then, Vincent turned to Catherine, acting like John and everyone else had just vanished into thin air. His face had changed, a mix of raw honesty and grit that touched her soul. He told her he'd spent 8 long years believing he wasn't meant to have anyone. That being alone was all his future held. But then she blew into his life like a blue norther, both for real and in his heart. And she changed everything. Vincent said she showed him he wasn't broken, just waiting for someone who understood his kind of quiet. That she saw past all the ugly things people said about him and found the real man underneath. That she was brave enough to stand by him when it would have been easier to just go along with the crowd. That she chose him over and over again, no matter how hard it got. And that was the most precious thing he had ever been given in his whole life. He took her hand, and right there, with half the town watching, he dropped to one knee. You could have heard a pin drop. Vincent pulled a simple ring from his pocket made of worked gold that you could tell was made by hand. He said it wasn't a fancy ring like she deserved, but he had forged it himself, hammering the metal on his anvil until it was just right, putting all his care and devotion for her into it. Vincent asked if Catherine would take him as her husband. He said he couldn't promise they wouldn't have hard times, but he promised a love with no strings attached. He promised to be a loyal partner, a faithful friend, and a safe harbor in any storm. He promised to see her, to really see her, every single day of their lives. He promised to honor her, to respect her, and to love her until his last breath left his body. And he promised to spend the rest of his life proving that she didn't make a mistake by choosing him. Tears were just streaming down Catherine's face. Her heart was so full, she thought it might just burst. She looked at that man, the tough rancher everyone was afraid of, kneeling there before her, offering her everything he was with such breaking honesty, and she knew without a single doubt it was the most beautiful proposal she could ever get in 1,000 lifetimes. She said yes, and then said it again, louder so everyone could hear. Yes, yes, 1,000 times over, yes. Vincent's hands trembled just a little as he slid the ring onto her finger. Then he stood up and wrapped her in a strong hug, Catherine held on to him, laughing and crying all at the same time. The room just erupted with all kinds of reactions. Some folks clapped for real, touched by what they'd just seen. Others just stood there, shocked, thinking it was a scandal. John Thatcher's face went beet red, and he spun around and stormed out of there. But Catherine didn't care about any of that. Vincent was holding her like she was the most precious thing in the whole world, and she was holding him right back, tying him to a world that had tried so hard to push him out. When they finally pulled back enough to look at each other, Vincent wiped her tears away so gently and asked if she was sure, if she wouldn't come to regret it. She laughed through her tears and told him she'd never been more sure of anything in her entire life. They left the dance not long after that, not because they were told to leave or because they were running away, but because they just didn't need to be there anymore. They had everything that mattered right there in each other. They walked through the town streets side by side, their hands laced together, already making plans for a future that was now a sure thing, instead of just a hopeful wish. Vincent talked about adding on to the house, about building that big porch she'd talked about. Catherine talked about planting a garden, about finally having a place to grow the flowers she always loved. He mentioned that maybe they could take a trip one day to see the ocean she'd always dreamed of seeing. She told him any place on earth would be perfect just as long as they were together. They were simple plans, but they were full of promise and all the good things to come. The wedding preparations were quick. Neither of them wanted a big fuss or a long wait. They set the date for October, just 6 weeks away. It was going to be a small ceremony, with just close family and a handful of true friends. Vincent didn't have any family of his own, but the Millers had kinda adopted him as their son. Anthony gave his official blessing, saying he saw the things that really mattered in Vincent: honesty, a strong work ethic, and a deep devotion to his daughter. The town stayed split down the middle. Some folks thought it was romantic, a real long-shot love story that was working out. Others kept on disapproving, saying Catherine was making a mistake she'd live to regret. John Thatcher disappeared for a few weeks, likely ashamed of being humiliated in public. When he came back, he was mighty careful to stay clear of any place where he might run into Vincent or Catherine. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning under a sky so blue it didn't have a single cloud. The church was only about half full, holding just the people who truly supported their union. Catherine wore a simple but beautiful dress that her mother had helped her sew. Vincent wore a suit that was obviously brand new and a little stiff on him, but he stood there, his eyes locked on his bride like she was some kind of miracle walking toward him. When the preacher asked if Vincent took Catherine to be his wife, his answer was strong and clear. "I do, with my whole heart." When he asked Catherine if she took Vincent, she smiled through happy tears and said, "I do, forever and a day." They exchanged simple rings and sealed their vows with a kiss that drew long sighs from the ladies in the pews, and even made a few of the old fellas get a little misty-eyed. And just like that, they were husband and wife, Vincent Drummond and Catherine Drummond. The party was small, but full of joy over at the Miller's house, with plenty of good food and soft music playing. Vincent was more relaxed than Catherine had ever seen him, laughing at stories Anthony told and accepting congratulations with a growing ease. She watched him changing right before her eyes. He wasn't becoming a different man, but he was finally letting the man he'd always been on the inside come out without being afraid. They set off for Wild Ridge Farm as the sun was going down. Vincent helped Catherine up onto the wagon, then climbed up right beside her. As they pulled away from the town, Catherine looked back one last time, not with sadness or regret, but with the feeling of a chapter closing. That old life where she was praised for her looks but never really known, where her beauty was both a blessing and a curse, where she felt like she was always on display but never truly seen, was over. A new life was beginning, and this one she had chosen with her eyes wide open and her heart completely sure. The farm greeted them in the last golden rays of sunlight. Vincent had spent weeks getting everything just perfect. The house was clean and tidy, with wildflowers in mason jars and a fire going in the fireplace to chase away the evening chill. Catherine walked from room to room, seeing all the little touches he'd added. There were new curtains on the windows, a new rug in the living room, and even a small bookshelf he'd built just for her books. She turned to him, her eyes burning with a fresh wave of emotion. Vincent was leaning against the doorframe, just watching her with a soft look on his face. He said he wanted her to feel like she was at home, that this place was theirs now, not just his. Catherine crossed the room, wrapped her arms around his neck, and said home wasn't a place, it was a person. She told him, "You are my home now, darling, wherever we happen to be." That first night, as husband and wife, was quiet and precious. Vincent was gentle and so careful with her, treating her with a kind of reverence that moved her deep in her soul. Catherine gave herself to him completely, trusting him with everything she had. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled up together under warm blankets, they both felt a deep sense of peace, of being whole, like all the scattered pieces of their lives had finally clicked into place. The months that came after were all about learning and discovering. Catherine learned the rhythms of the farm, the daily chores of caring for the animals, the seasons of planting and harvesting. It wasn't an easy life. It meant hard work from sunup to sundown. But she loved it. Out there, she had a freedom she'd never known back in town. She could wake up early and watch the sunrise without having to worry about who might see her. She could work in her garden with her hands in the dirt, without anyone judging her. She could just be herself. Vincent blossomed too. With Catherine there by his side, the deep loneliness he had carried for so many years just melted away. The house that had always been too quiet was now filled with laughter and music. He found joy again in the little things like sharing breakfast, talking about the day's chores, and telling stories by the fire at night. Catherine taught him how to dance right there in the kitchen, with no one watching but them, moving together, a little clumsy but so happy. He played his harmonica for her, playing the sad and beautiful songs his father had taught him. She painted watercolors of the farm, capturing all the beauty she saw in it every day. They went into the village every now and then, always together. The way people treated them slowly got better. Folks saw that their marriage was strong and that Catherine was truly happy. Some of the people who had been the most critical even admitted that maybe they had been wrong. Others just finally accepted it. John Thatcher eventually married a girl from the next town over and stopped causing them trouble. Life moved on, and Vincent and Catherine became just another married couple, not the town scandal. But out on their farm, far away from all the prying eyes, they built something truly special. It was not just a marriage, it was a real partnership. When there were decisions to be made about the land, he listened to Catherine's thoughts and truly valued them. Whenever she came up with a way to make things better, he put her ideas into action. They toiled together in the fields, looked after the livestock as a team, and stood shoulder to shoulder against every problem. One time, a fierce storm ripped off a piece of the barn roof, and they spent days mending it under the blazing sun. Another year, a hard winter came through and took some of their cattle. They mourned the loss together, and then they kept going. A drought came and tested their grit, but they conserved every drop of water, changed their plans, and made it through. With every hardship they faced, they grew stronger and closer. And there were good times, too. The first bountiful harvest after Catherine helped him redraw the layout of the fields. The day Vincent finally finished that big porch he'd been promising, and they sat out there all night long, just watching the stars and sharing their dreams. The morning Catherine woke up and knew, deep in her bones, that she was completely and truly happy, with no second thoughts or worries. The evening Vincent held her close and whispered that she was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he had no idea how he'd managed for so long without her. The years went by, not too fast and not too slow. They just passed, with each day holding its own share of work, troubles, little bits of happiness, and a steady, constant love. Vincent and Catherine grew older together, not all at once, but little by little. A few more smile lines around her eyes, a touch of gray at his temples, hands that grew tougher with work, but still reached for each other all the time. The farm flourished under their combined effort, expanding bit by bit as they bought up neighboring land and grew the herd. The house got bigger, with new rooms that Vincent had planned out. Catherine's garden bloomed into a riot of color you could see clear from the road. Now and then, travelers making their way through the area would remark on how beautiful the place was, on the feeling of peace that seemed to settle over Wild Ridge Farm. The town changed, too. New folks moved in, and a younger generation grew up who didn't know anything about the old ways of thinking. To them, Vincent and Catherine were just that nice couple with the farm up in the hills, known for their warm welcome and their solid-as-an-oak marriage. The days of being isolated and judged were a distant memory for everyone but the two who had lived through it. 4 years after their wedding, on a morning so beautiful it could break your heart, Catherine and Vincent were sitting on the porch he built. Their coffee sat forgotten in the cups, growing cold as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A soft breeze drifted by, carrying the sweet smell of the garden and fresh-cut grass. It was one of those perfect, simple moments that are so precious because they're real. Vincent had his arm wrapped around Catherine's shoulders. She was leaning her head against his chest. He said in a low, contented voice that he never in his life thought it could be like this. So simple, but so whole, so quiet, but so full. Catherine smiled, and she agreed, saying that the storm that nearly ended her life was the very thing that saved it, because it brought her straight to him. Vincent kissed the top of her head, a simple, loving gesture that had become second nature over the years. He said that every single choice he'd ever made, every tough spot he'd ever been in was worth it, because it all led to this very moment, this life, and this woman right here in his arms. Catherine turned her face to look up at him, meeting his gaze. Even after all their years together, there was still that jolt of recognition, that little spark that always lit up when they truly looked at one another. She told him that he had changed her whole world. Before she met him, she was adrift in a sea of empty compliments, slowly going under without even knowing it. He was the one who saw her when she felt invisible, who valued her when everyone else just saw a pretty face. He gave her more than just love. He gave her the freedom to be her true self. She said their love story was the most beautiful one of all because it was real, built on a foundation of honesty and respect, and the choice they made every single day to put each other first. Vincent was never a man of many words, but he said with a certainty that came from the bottom of his soul that she was his everything. That she had turned an empty ranch into a home bursting with life. That she had turned a guarded, wounded man into someone who could love without being afraid. That every day he spent with her was a gift. Every night was a blessing. And that he would spend the rest of his days thanking whatever hand of fate or act of God had turned that wagon over in the storm and set her right in his path. They stayed just like that for a good long while as the sun climbed higher, washing the whole world in its golden light. They were two people who couldn't have been more different, who found each other when the odds were stacked against them. The gruff rancher that the world had judged so harshly, and the kind woman the world admired for all the wrong reasons. Together they discovered something that most people spend their entire lives looking for and never find. A true, deep, life-changing love. Theirs was no fairy tale where everything was perfect from the get-go. It was something much better. It was a real story with its share of struggles and hard times, with back-breaking work and moments of doubt. But it was a story where two people chose each other again and again, where their love grew and deepened and got stronger with every passing year and every trial they faced. It was a story about courage. Catherine's courage to turn her back on what everyone expected, to follow her heart instead of doing what was proper. Vincent's courage to let his guard down again, to trust someone after being hurt, and to believe he was worthy of being loved. The courage they both had to build a life on their own terms, paying no mind to the critics and the doubters. It was a story about change. Vincent, who had spent years thinking he was destined to be alone, became a devoted husband and a loving partner. Catherine, who had spent her whole life being praised for her looks, became a whole and happy woman, truly seen and loved for the person she was inside. But more than anything, it was a story about recognition. Two souls who, by a twist of fate, saw in each other the very thing they had been searching for without even knowing it. In Catherine, Vincent saw a genuine goodness, a quiet strength, and the ability to look past a rough exterior. In Catherine, Vincent saw a rock-solid honesty, a silent power, and a loyal heart hidden behind walls built up over years of hurt. And once they found each other, once they really saw each other, there was nothing else they could do but fall in love. Not a shallow love based on looks or what was convenient, but a deep love built on mutual respect, true admiration, and the conscious decision to walk side by side through life. Years down the road, when folks in town would tell stories about the famous couples from around the area, they always brought up Vincent and Catherine Drummond. They'd talk about the dramatic rescue during the storm, about the unlikely romance that nobody approved of, and about the marriage everyone swore was doomed to fail, but instead thrived. Their story turned into a local legend, one that parents told their children to teach them about looking past appearances, about having the nerve to follow your heart, and about the value of a true love. But for Vincent and Catherine, it was never a legend. It was just their life. And what a fine life it was. Full of hard work, you bet, but also full of laughter. Full of challenges, absolutely, but also full of small, precious victories. Full of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because they shared them. They would grow old together on that farm up in the hills. They would watch the seasons turn hundreds of times over. Every spring would bring new life. Every summer would bring plenty. Every fall would bring the harvest. And every winter would bring a well-earned rest. And through it all, they would have each other, a constant comfort, a love that never wavered, a true partnership. Because in the end, that really was the most beautiful love story. Not because it was easy or flawless, but because it was real. Because it was chosen. Because two people, each with their own scars and their own hopes, found healing and a true home in one another. Vincent Drummond, the stern, solitary rancher everyone steered clear of, found warmth and belonging in Catherine's arms. Catherine Miller, the woman known for being sweet but never really known at all, found someone who saw every part of her and loved her for it all. And together, against all odds, against the town's judgment and loud disapproval, they built something that would last longer than their own lives. A legacy not of money or status, but of genuine love. The living proof that when the right two people find each other, nothing else in the world matters. Not what people say, not how things look, not what anyone else thinks. Just love, true and deep and life-changing and forever. And that was more than enough. That right there was everything.